It was about a vision for changing the world. Long before the terms global warming and climate change were part of our everyday vocabulary, especially here at Iowa State, Wangari recognized that there was a link between trees and climate stabilization. For her, planting trees was a pro-life commitment. Women planting trees honored the sanctity of life, not only human, but also animal life, because fragile ecosystems were being renewed with each tree planted. By planting indigenous trees in Kenya, soil retention, stabilization of rivers, and agricultural production could be improved. Soon she recognized that planting trees was about more than strengthening the bonds, was about more than just the trees themselves, but was also about strengthening the bonds of peace among peoples. In her post-Nobel Peace Prize reflections on the significance of the Green Belt movement, Mathai stated, "Trees have been an essential part of my life and have provided me with many lessons. Trees are living symbols of peace and hope. A tree has roots in the soil, yet reaches to the sky. It tells us that in order to aspire, we need to be grounded, and that no matter how high we go, it is from our roots that we will draw sustenance." Today, many people find themselves living in a world in which hope and peace are in short supply, including in the part of the world from which Wangari Maathai came. In this time of global economic crisis that continues, of longing for elusive peace in many parts of the world, and of global warming or climate change that threatens the lives of thousands of children and hundreds of wildlife species, especially in East Africa, reasons for hope beg for attention. In the Christian tradition, hope is a virtue that prompts people to resist despair and to work for the coming reign of God. As Paul in the letter to the Romans put it, hope prompts persons to trust that all things can work together for good for those who love God. Where peace is concerned, by receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Mathai put a face, an African woman's face, on the problem of global warming and climate change, and pointed to why addressing this problem is important to achieving world peace. So, some of you may be wondering, why a supple lecture on Wangari Maathai? Last year I spoke on Jesus and his relationships. This seems like a 180, okay? Some of you may be wondering this, but on Sunday, September 25th, 2011, Wangari Maathai died after a long battle with cancer. And in my judgment, her death was a major loss for the world. Having read her memoir entitled Unbowed, published a few years after she received the Nobel Peace Prize, I recalled reading Wangari, who was then known by her baptismal name, Mary Jo, shortened form for Mary Josephine, at a Catholic function in the mid-1960s. She was a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was an undergraduate at Carlow College nearby. As I read this book, and then her others, I recognized that the choices she made regarding issues of justice in her native Kenya were compatible with, if not outright influenced by, Catholic social thought. So, major elements of Catholic social thought that I find in her writings, especially in her more scholarly book called The Challenge for Africa. Among them are respect for the dignity of every person, especially of the poor, a foundational principle for all elements of Catholic social teaching. Promotion of the common good. Global solidarity for the sake of development. Peacemaking. And responsible stewardship of creation. So my purpose in this lecture is to point out how her work with the Green Belt movement exemplifies some of these Catholic social values as I tell her heroic story. On the surface, Mathai may seem like an unlikely woman to be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. A member of the Kikuyu tribe, most of which live near Mount Kenya, located in the country's central highlands, Mathai was born in 1940 in a Kenya then under British rule. Her father worked on a British-owned farm or plantation, and her mother, like most women of Kenya, was a subsistence farmer, growing crops such as corn, millet, and sweet potatoes. Although Wangari grew up economically poor, thanks largely to her mother, her childhood was spiritually rich. Discerning and self-determined even as a child, a trait that would continue throughout her life even more so, Mathai chose at age 12 to become the first member of her family to be baptized as a Roman Catholic. She took the name Mary Josephine in honor of the parents of Jesus, so she would feel really close to him. Remember, she's about 12, okay? And she participated zealously in the Legion of Mary, which was she would say something like a little sodality or whatever, meeting groups that came together with the slogan, to serve God by serving our fellow human beings. And she said this is a slogan that she took deep into her heart at a young age and continued to try to live for the rest of her life. So, Wangari Maathai's education. Exceptionally intelligent and ever eager to learn, Maathai was awarded 5 scholarships in her lifetime. I'm kind of jealous, to be honest, okay? 5 scholarships. 2 to Catholic convent boarding schools in Kenya. 1 English-speaking and the other Italian. A 3rd, thanks to a Kennedy African Airlift Scholarship to Mount St. Scholastica College, now known as Benedictine College in Kansas. So here's this woman from Kenya, from the highlands of Kenya, moving to Kansas. Can you just imagine? Okay, just say, where's the mountains? None. Okay. There she received a Bachelor of Science degree in biology with minors in chemistry and German, which she would use later. Thanks to a 4th scholarship from the Africa America Institute, she then earned a master's degree in biology from the University of Pittsburgh. And then while in Pittsburgh, she became aware of civil rights movement and Martin Luther King just starting his work, and of the very early stages of the women's movement at the University of Pittsburgh. So a 5th scholarship comes her way. She's provided with a scholarship for a PhD from the University College of Nairobi, which included semesters at the University of Gießen and the University of Munich to gain access to better equipment and better libraries, and also to make good use of the German she learned as an undergraduate. With her dissertation on the development and differentiation of gonads in bovines, cattle domesticated by the Maasai tribe and East African buffalo, successfully defended in 1971, look how fast-track her PhD was. That was pretty quick. She became the first Eastern African woman to earn a doctorate in anything, any subject. Here we see the 18, maybe 19-year-old Mary Jo Muda Wangari Maathai, recipient of 2 Kennedy-sponsored scholarships, meeting President Kennedy. Pretty neat, isn't it? You notice that how she's not outnumbered by the fellas? There weren't all that many women who were getting this scholarship, by the way. Okay. So, now to get back to something perhaps a little bit deeper and more serious. Okay. So, we have here a picture of an African stool. A seat supported by 3 sturdy legs. Kind of a universal kind of piece of furniture. But more an activist than a theoretician, in her most scholarly monograph that I already mentioned to you, The Challenge for Africa, which she published in 2009, Mathai integrates concern for ecologically sustainable development, the welfare of women, and elements of Catholic social thought, especially the affirmation of the foundational principle for the dignity of the human person, in a model that draws on the symbolism of this African stool, this simple seat with 3 legs. Looks like a milking stool back on my grandfather's farm, to be honest, but moving right ahead. Okay. Mathai associates the first leg of her stool with democratic space, where rights, both human and environmental, are supported. She argues for the necessity of democratic governments in Africa and envisioned democracy to be a fair and just society in which both women and men can fully participate in multi-party elections, something that did not exist in her native Kenya at all. Okay? She also looked for a balance of power between women and men, correcting the gender inequity she associated with patriarchal patterns of colonialists, patterns that were continued after sub-Saharan African countries, especially her native Kenya, gained independence from Great Britain. The second leg of her stool, the sustainable management of natural resources. She puts that forward to ensure the needs of future generations, especially of the people on the margins of society. She wants to make sure that sustainable management of natural resources is a value that will not be compromised. Mathai would link sustainable management of natural resources with safeguarding the dignity of the poor. She stresses that when the environment is degraded, people already poor become poor and are robbed of their full humanity and their struggle to survive. Persons in power then seek to control scarce resources using, too often, violent means, driving the poor from their homelands and even killing them. Believing that most conflicts in Africa, such as those in Somalia, very right near Kenya, and Sudan, another country that's opposite direction but near, let me get my third thing here. She began to talk a great deal and argue for the development of cultures of peace. She said we need to have a mindset as a people that will affirm compassion, forgiveness, and justice. And in her most recent book, she associates these as virtues with Jesus Christ, who proclaimed, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Mathai argues that these needed virtues will merely be utopian aspirations if Africans in desperation fight one another over scarce resources instead of working together to rehabilitate their land. So the emphasis she associated with the 3 legs of her African stool resonate not only with basic elements of Catholic social thought, but also with explicit teachings by popes such as Paul VI, who in a document called Development of Peoples, published in 1967, and John Paul II on social concern 20 years later in 1987. Both of these popes stressed that while economic development is very important, it must be always measured and oriented to full, authentic human development. It's not development for its own sake. It must keep people, all people, in mind. Put simply, development is not having more, but is becoming more through shared concern for the human family. And Pope Benedict XVI, or the current Pope, now I guess in Cuba, affirms this basic message in his letter of 2009 called Caritas in Veritate, or Charity in Truth. And he also puts forward a very important dimension that the other two popes did not give as much attention to. And that is, he talks about the natural environment as a gift given by God to everyone, not just for those who can grab it, to everyone. Because nature is a gift entrusted to humanity by God, humans together have a responsibility to find ways to work in solidarity, to promote the protection of land, water, and air as gifts of the Creator. If you want to look it up, you can find that between numbers 49 and 51 in that letter. Matthi's call to women and men to come together to create a democratic space exemplifies the three popes' emphasis on solidarity, working together. People can cast aside their differences, whether they're tribal or national or different class, and together act as one human family to the benefit of all. In particular, the links that Mattei made regarding sustainable management of natural resources and forming cultures of peace would also be related to Pope Paul VI's emphasis in development of peoples, in which he stressed that authentic civic progress and economic development are the only roads to lasting peace. Paul, and then Paul VI, and then later John Paul II will build on it, stressed this. It's a very simple sentence. Development is the new name for peace. So easy to remember. Development. That all can survive. Good, healthy development of natural resources. Good, sustainable management is the new name for peace. Sounds like a wonderful slogan. It's hard, however, to really make it happen. Anyway. So the three legs of Mattei's stool support the seat. She also has symbolism associated with that and gives a deeper take on it. And she talks about it as a milieu. This is where you can tell she has this little thing called a PhD in something, you know. Not your everyday word. I'm sure her own people would say, milieu, what is that? But anyway, in which development that does not reduce nature and persons to commodities, but celebrates their sacredness can happen. So she's talking, again, that just flows straight from the culture of peace, okay? Straight from it. Develop a culture of peace. The way we talk to each other, relate to the world, relate to the resources, all comes together. And this was her vision. This is a vision that she doesn't really write about until 2009, because then she has everybody's attention post Nobel Peace Prize. But this is a vision that she was living all along. So, Wangari Maathai, in an interview in 1993, before all that many people knew about her, admitted, she said, you know, I had this great desire to do this for a very long time, but I gradually came to see that needed changes in Kenya could not happen just by wishful thinking or by magic. So she said, I decided that it would be women who would do it. Okay? It's women who must make what is needed happen. Okay? So, love that little quote from Greta Gard. This insight informed her decision to focus on women as the creators of the milieu needed for a healthy democracy, in which sustainable management of resources and forming a culture of peace would be priorities, and her own beloved Kenya. And then she started to dream, if it can happen in parts of Kenya, maybe it can happen in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not going to stop once I get started, okay? So, meanwhile, she did have to start. And so with the devastating effects of wishful thinking, sorry about that. I'm just so excited about her work that I'm just sort of like over the top here. Okay. With the devastating effects of deforestation in Kenya ever before her, she decided, I'm going to mobilize women to plant trees. Okay. Kenya's original forests of a century earlier, or a century and a half earlier, had been cut at a 90% level. It still has a long way to go. Okay? So this is old growth indigenous forests were cut. So she said, this problem is around all of us, but nobody seems to be seeing it. But I see it as the problem it is. So she pointed out what was obvious. Kenya could not hope to survive without healthy forests. Kenya's agricultural, wildlife, tourism, energy, virtually Kenya's whole economy needed a renewed presence of indigenous trees. So, indigenous trees. I'm going to share with you what I consider one of her most touching stories about trees in her memoir, Unbowed. Planting trees for Matai was about more than concern about Kenya's economy. Yes, she was deeply concerned about it, but it was about more than that for her. As I've already noted in my citation of her Nobel Peace Prize reflections, right after she received the honor, she said very pointedly that she had learned many memorable lessons from trees. Trees are living symbols of hope and peace. So the importance of indigenous trees was not something Wangari Maathai said she learned at the university she attended. People were not talking about the importance of trees and reforestation at St. Benedict's, or Scholastica, if you will, anyway, or even at Pitt. She learned it first and foremost from her own mother, Wanjiru Kibishu. And if I mispronounced it, I hope she'll forgive me. Anyway. So in her book, Unbowed, Maathai speaks of one of the most memorable of the tribal traditions she learned at her mother's knee when she was a wee girl. The indigenous fig tree, Ngumo, regarded by the Kikuyu to be the sacred tree of God, was a teacher about ecosystems that she did not recognize until much later in her life. As a child, Maathai saw that beneath the large fig tree near her home was a stream of crystal clear water that continued to bubble to the surface, creating a stream along which banana plants and sugar cane and other food crops grew. She talks about, as a little child, playing with the frogs and trying to catch frog eggs to bring them together to make little necklaces for herself, and that never worked. She was very frustrated when she was 7 years old. Anyway. Then as an adult, she had this insight. The fig tree was really a center of a miniature ecosystem because the roots of the Mangamo, the fig tree, broke through the rocks, releasing the life-giving water of an underground river. So around fig trees, where she lived, they have these little springs of water and this little, like, oasis. Okay? So she began to contemplate her experience of the local fig tree. And then began to think about all the trees. It's not only the fig trees, but all indigenous trees are sacred. They're gifts from God. And so she began to take pride in the ecological balance that her Kikuyu ancestors had honored, but then had been compromised. So this balance contrasted sharply in her mind with the conquering Europeans who treated African territories as possessions to exploit because they lacked a fundamental religious respect for the land. In the pre-colonial era, land in Africa was the common property of all the tribes. They shared it as they needed it. When Matai was a child in the mid-1940s, the British colonial government claimed ownership of the land around where she lived, around the little village where her mother and other of her relatives lived, and ordered large areas of Kenya's indigenous forests to be burned in order to plant cash crops. She recalls being grief-stricken as old-growth forests were consumed in flames to be replaced by coffee and tea plantations and by tree farms of softwood pines. Cut them down and we could send them to Europe and make lots of money, okay? Softwood pines just don't do all that well, however, in her part of the world. And she also talked about the eucalyptus trees, which in the Kenyan dialect meant water guzzler. And one of the reasons for these eucalyptus trees was when people burned their garbage to sort of give a sweeter scent to their trash, they use branches with leaves on them from the eucalyptus tree. She thought that was insane. Maybe a few of you might too, okay? Much to her dismay, the patterns of ecosystem destruction were intricately continued by the Kenyan government after 1963, when her homeland gained independence from the British. There was an opportunity to change. Change did not happen. In the 1970s, as Matai began to develop a strong ecological consciousness, it became clear to her that the people of Kenya could not survive without potable drinking water, most of which came from the forested mountains. Nor could they live without the food grown in the fertile fields, watered by the rains or irrigated by natural streams that were also linked to the health of the forests. She concluded that unless there was reforestation of indigenous trees on a massive scale, her homeland would become a desert. More families would be malnourished, and indigenous animals would become extinct. With time, she concluded that since all humans and every animal needs trees to recycle carbon dioxide and provide oxygen so that they can breathe, deforestation is not merely a local problem for Kenya and other regions of Africa, such as the Congo Basin. She has lots of memories of visiting the Congo Basin and seeing that being clear-cut. But it is also a global one. To plant a tree is to help to save the planet. It was during the 1970s that Matai became increasingly more attuned to the global struggles of women, made even stronger during the United Nations Decade for Women. She observed firsthand that African women who traditionally had the responsibility to till the land for food, the food needed for household consumption, were suffering the most from deforestation in Kenya. Women were doing over 80% of the work in rural areas. Many of their husbands were off at plantations or doing other jobs and came back periodically. What these women were expected to do was to work in the fields to grow the food for the family, take care of the children, and then gather firewood. Often this would take a mile or more walk to get firewood. They were also responsible for taking the food they grew to the local market to sell. They were very busy. Although women were the major contributors to African family life and therefore to African society, they were ignored systematically in planting agricultural products, especially those related to crops that were cash crops that could be exported to Europe and elsewhere. Okay, so in 1977, Mathai invited women to work with her in this new movement to plant trees. The convergence of a two-pronged awareness of the plight of women and environmental degradation prompted her to invite women to work with her in launching a new movement. We will come together. We will plant trees. On the surface, the Green Belt movement seemed to be about rural women planting bands of trees near human settlements to earn a bit of money. When they started in 1977, each woman got 4 U.S. equivalent cents for each healthy seedling that could be retransplanted back in the forest. 4 cents, folks, 4 cents. And with it, a little bit of economic independence. But as Mathai points out, a major goal of the Greenbelt movement was to enable these women to gain self-determination and empowerment through their reforestation efforts. By linking environmental restoration and women's empowerment, Mathai initiated sort of like a feminist grassroots effort with ripples throughout her native Kenya and then beyond to the rest of Africa. Mathai's strategy was to draw attention to the link between the impoverishment of African land and human poverty, which affects women more severely than most men in her society. Again, because the women do most of the family farming, wood gathering for cooking, water collecting, and so forth for their families. So this picture of these women heavily burdened with all this wood would be a common thing that they would have to do 2 or 3 times a week at least so that they could have enough firewood to cook their food. So here's a picture of Mount Kenya, referred to by the Kikuyu as God's sacred mountain. Notice the snow on the mountain in Africa, so you get how high it is there, okay? A scientist by education, and certainly not a theologian, as she makes clear in her writings, Mathai at once gives witness to Catholic belief in the sacramentality of creation and in her Kikuyu heritage of celebrating the sacredness of creatures. The mountain was a sacred mountain of God, just as the fig tree was a sacred tree of God. She argued that when people use biblical religion to legitimate the domination of creation, rationalizing illegal logging and clear cutting and planting of non-indigenous species, this does not fulfill the directive to have dominion over earth. Earth is entrusted to creatures who image God, to guard it as God would. Rather, such action is actually for her a sin. To abuse the environment is a sin against the Creator. She also stressed that when we degrade the planet, we also degrade ourselves. diminishing our own God-given dignity. Conversely, when people work to heal earth, they themselves experience the deep healing persons long for, that only God and being in right relationship with each other and with nature can give. So, Mathai was both a realistic and hopeful woman. She realistically saw and attended to the problems of injustice afflicting post-colonial Africa, both the land and its people. But hope is also evident in Mathai's poignant words from her Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. I'm going to repeat them again because I want you to leave here, I hope, with this message. The tree for me is hope. It is the future. When I look at a tree, I see promise. It starts from a seed. Eventually, it becomes a huge tree. But actually, it also becomes an ecosystem in itself. Hope applies to more than trees. The virtue of hope applies to women who planted them, poor, uneducated women who dared to ignore the skeptics who argued that for tree planting to succeed, it should be done by professional foresters with college degrees. And she said, no. By responding to Mathai's call for women to act in traditional Kenyan Harambee spirit, in fact, originally the movement was called Harambee for trees, and she realized that if you go outside the Kikuyu language, you sort of lost everybody. But this is a word that means, let us pull together, okay? Let us pull together, let's do something. So this is a spirit, and scores of women traded fear for hope by coming to these early Harambee sessions. In a single season, 1,000 or more seedlings that women had nurtured were planted in belts. This is where you get the name for the Green Belt movement. Belts of trees, nice lines of trees, okay? Near human populations, on public lands, especially in mountainous regions where indigenous forests had previously grown, singing as they labored. From the beginning of the movement, Mathai recognized that education would be the key to success of this new movement in Africa. So this insight led her to engage women in communal problem-solving seminars, arboreal colleges. Amazing, you know? Such creativity, okay. That since 85% of the Kenyans were Christian, often began with prayer, sometimes Bible readings, some rousing hymn singing. So get up their spirits, okay? She then guided the interaction by posing basic questions such as, what problems do we see in our community? Fairly non-threatening questions. Where do these problems come from? Can you name their causes? And what might be some solutions, some actions that we can undertake together to make needed change? So, her three-step method of engagement is similar to the C, judge, act dynamic, steps, Catholic social action model, traceable to a Belgian priest named Joseph Cargin, who in 1924 founded the Christian Workers' Movement. And he lived long enough to become a bishop and then a cardinal, who became a good friend of Pope John the 23rd, and in a little encyclical called On Christianity and Social Progress, put out in 1961, and then later in the Second Vatican Council, Cargin's model for Catholic social action was shared around the world. See, judge, act. The Green Belt Movement seminars also modeled the enactment of the Catholic social principle of subsidiarity already mentioned. The first task of solidarity is the willingness to be educated when the information makes one uncomfortable. So we have this see what's around you. Make a judgment. Don't just let yourself get depressed about it. Try to make a difference. Try to get other people to care with you, okay? And then act. Do something. It may not be the best thing. You'll learn from your mistakes. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. That was true for Father Karjin, 1924, as a very young priest. It's true for Rangari Matai in 1970s, okay? So, the challenging task for her was, okay, as you learn this knowledge, what are you going to do with it? You know, we have to be willing to be educated and we have to do something. So she wanted to try to help the women not only to do this action, but to learn more about themselves, okay? So that self-knowledge would be something they could hand on and help their children with. So what she did, she invited the women as they were analyzing, going through these steps, to try to be attentive. Which mirror, meaning which sense of yourself, are you giving the loudest voice to in your own mind, in your own heart? So to help the mostly poor and virtually illiterate women, she went through these mirroring exercises. I think maybe there's probably some of us that might benefit from them too. As you analyze the problems, is the mirror you're using that of the colonizers, still living on in another generation, even though we have freedom from the British now? Okay. Is it from the current oppressive government officials? Okay. Which mirror are you looking into? Is it your husband's mirror? Or, guess what the next one is going to be? Anybody want to take a guess? Too bad I'm not in the classroom. This would be more fun anyway. Is it your own mirror? Now, just be with that for a minute, okay? You can see uneducated, poor women, 1970s, 80s, and then forward. It's going to be pretty important. So, the seminars were called self-knowledge seminars. I have that here in Kikuyu, but I just don't dare try to murder the language here. But anyway. And they were designed to call forth women's empowerment and a spirit of solidarity, so that together, what is the common good of the community would be something they would really not just know intellectually, but feel and be committed to. So, here's a picture of some of those women. Sorry, the previous picture was pretty bad, but do the best you can when you're downloading things from the internet. Anyway, so through the education seminars, women became aware that planting trees or advocating for saving the forests was part of a much larger evolving mission. And according to Matai, by clothing the naked earth, and she speaks of this sometimes as an ecological work of mercy, especially in her last, more spiritual book, Kenyan women were laying the groundwork for equitable economic development for their country and modeling what is possible for women in the continent of Africa and beyond. The women themselves could see firsthand the powerful truth of Rangari's promise that what they were doing mattered, and they would take inspiration from her words as they worked together to heal the earth. They themselves realized they were becoming healed. One of the unique attributes of the Greenbelt movement today is that it is a value-driven organization committed to the United Nations Millennium Goals, Development Goals, which I'm sure everybody here at Iowa State probably is aware of. And soon after the goals were approved in 2000, Matai emphasized that achieving the Millennium Goals, there were 8 in all, really was dependent on the 7th, that there would be a healthy environment. That, for her, was the pivotal one. And she recognized that the third, gender equality, was directly related to the achievement of the seventh. And so she stressed that without women taking up the mantle of equality and contributing their energy to environmental sustainability, the likelihood of achieving this goal or any of those Millennium Development Goals, and they were supposed to be achieved, most of them, by 2015, okay? Everything hinged on these two. So, Mathai stressed that although tree planting requires women to bend to earth, in reality, with each act on behalf of environmental sustainability, they were rising up unbowed. That's the significance of the title. And then they could stand together and claim their dignity and walk together into a better and more hope-filled future for themselves and their families, mindful that what they could achieve had not only local but global importance. So the other part of her response when she was given the Nobel Peace Prize is she spoke not only about trees being symbols of hope, but also of being symbols of peace. Now, if I was going to do complete justice to this topic, it would be like another whole talk. So I'll just give you some highlights, because I know that you don't want to be here forever, okay? But I do recommend that you read some of her books if you can find the time. Mathai stressed that although tree planting requires women to bend to earth, as I said, they're unbowed. That's people themselves. They realize themselves their power to be peacemakers. So peace obviously has global importance today, and a major facet of the Greenbelt movement is a commitment to conflict management and peace building. Try to, women, we cannot be fighting with each other, okay? We have to keep our eye on the prize, which is peace and environmental sustainability. So, she speaks often in her writings about the symbolism of peace trees in sub-Saharan Africa. She reflects, here I will quote her, "In time, the tree became a symbol of peace and conflict resolution, especially during our seem to be ever-recurring ethnic and tribal conflicts in Kenya. When the Greenbelt movement used peace trees to reconcile disputing communities, they followed the examples of the elders, especially of the Kikuyu, who would carry a staff from a thigi tree. When placed between two disputing groups, this was to cause them to disarm themselves, to stop fighting, and really to seek reconciliation." Okay? So she said, this is something we need to do. Notice how she really focuses a lot on the symbolism of things. So in her efforts to link peacemaking with planting trees, the Greenbelt movement in the 1980s really anticipated something that Pope John Paul II would write in 1990 on a World Day of Peace. Peace with God, the Creator, peace with all creation. There is a growing awareness, he writes, that world peace is threatened not only by the arms race, regional conflicts, continued injustices among peoples and nations, but also by the lack of due respect for nature, by plundering the natural resources, and by a progressive decline in the quality of life. So, for Wangari Maathai and the Greenbelt movement, the struggle for peace was very, very real. Due constraints of time, as I said, I'm not going to get through all these issues, but I want to just say this. The Greenbelt movement took it upon itself, those women, you saw the picture of those few women in the back, okay? Back a few slides. To resist the dictatorial and violent practices of their second president of Kenya, Daniel Toroitich arap Moi, who had 5 terms as Kenya's president. He always got elected. There was only one party, and he was the head of it. Pretty much ensures you're going to be elected. So, suffice it to say that the struggle of peace was very real. Many of these women paid dearly for standing up in peaceful demonstrations for democratic elections. The first leg of Wangari Maathai's African stool. And for the protection of public lands, which he was giving away practically to his cronies. So this is Wangari Maathai's take on it. So they wanted better land management. Because of her efforts, Wangari Maathai was imprisoned. Solitary confinement for a while. Then later they had mercy on her. She did have children. And she was put under house arrest. One example will suffice, I think, to illustrate the commitment of this peace building of the Green Belt movement women. Early in the 1990s, President Moi announced a plan to build a 62 stories headquarters for the Konyu Party, his own party, and for offices of international businesses in the park that was public land, in this little forest oasis in the capital city. So, at a 1992 tree planting protest of the Freedom Corridor of Nairobi's Uhuru Park, women of the Green Belt movement were beaten by military police when they refused to disperse. Now, the women themselves decided to respond by baring their breasts to these men. You'll say, why? Baring her breasts to these men? This was a sign that women rarely did, something they rarely did to their teenage and adult sons, to remind them, we are the ones who bore you. To do this to us is like desecrating your own mother, okay? And many of those women were 40 plus, okay? So, President Moi was in the process of borrowing $20 million with no idea, $20 million with no idea about how he would repay it to build this monument, in a sense, to himself, because part of the plan was to have a 15-story likeness of himself in front of the building. Okay? So, fearing arrest, many of the women fled and sought asylum in Nairobi's nearby Anglican Cathedral, where they remained for a year to escape arrest. They rotated hunger strikes to keep their cause in the news. Wangari Maathai started writing everybody she could think of, including Al Gore, to get some help with this, to bring this to an end. On December 29, 1992, a multi-party election was held for the first time. Moi did get reelected with 35% of the vote. It's too bad there were so many parties. But that was less than 2% more than his closest rival. 10 more years of Moi, and then a new election. After 24 years of struggle against his government, another multi-party Democratic election was held, and Kibaki was elected president. Maathai was elected to Parliament with an overwhelming, notice the number there, 98% of the vote. She got more votes for any office than anybody else. 98%. Okay, and she was appointed the Assistant Minister for the Environment, Natural Resources, and Wildlife. I'm not really sure why she was assistant, other than perhaps her gender. Okay. So, today in this very park in which the Green Belt movement women risked their lives to preserve their precious park, their oasis of trees in the middle of the city, there is this memorial. And at its dedication, Wangari said this. She said more than this, but I'll just give you one little part of what she said. When I see Uhuru Park and contemplate its meaning, I feel compelled to fight for it so that my grandchildren may share the dream and that joy of freedom as they one day walk there. they may have this freedom, that there is a place, okay, where rich and poor can come together and just enjoy that little oasis. So after her reception of the Nobel Peace Prize, Mathai helped to found the Nobel Women's Initiative, along with 5 other women who had received a Nobel Prize over the years. And her participation in the Nobel's initiative, Peace Prize initiative, took her to Sudan in 2008 with a mission: bring awareness of massive violations of women's rights there, advocate for the participatory government through monitored elections that permits not only men but also women to actually vote, to give encouragement to women's groups working for peace and reconciliation to stand in solidarity with all who will work for peace in the Sudan, and to call upon citizens throughout the world to take individual and collective action to build a sustainable peace with justice in the region. So they had these 5 things they were going to try to accomplish. So Mathai drew attention to the fact that the tragic state of affairs in Western Sudan, especially the region of Darfur, although and it's still so hard there, although sometimes attributed to religious and ethnic conflict, she said, yes, that's a contributor, but it is also due to the relentless expansion of the Sahara Desert, caused primarily, she believes, by global warming. She says that the conflict in Darfur is an example of climate change-induced warfare. There's such a scarcity of goods, people are desperate, they'll kill each other for a bucket of water. Increase in the temperature in the Indian Ocean, attributed largely to industrial pollution accompanied by deforestation that went back to the colonial period, has resulted in 40% decline in rainfall and the extreme drought, especially in the Darfur region of Sudan, but it certainly is also true in Somalia and in other places. So Mathai's analysis of the situation could possibly have been informed by Pope Benedict's World Day of Peace, or perhaps she informed him, in which he stressed, we cannot remain indifferent before the problems associated with climate change, including desertification and the deforestation of equatorial and tropical regions. Indeed, maintaining passivity in the face of actual and potential conflicts involving access to natural resources has never been and is not now a viable option. So, I'm coming to conclusions. So my primary emphasis in this presentation has been on Wangari Maathai's achievements. And the sub-theme has been Catholic social thought, as I see it reflected in or influencing possibly her work. In Catholicism, saints matter. Certainly Wangari Maathai exhibits what philosopher Edith Wishgrad has written, and that is the supreme moral principle of the saint. She describes as seeing the material conditions of the suffering other with the unfaltering response of putting oneself at their disposal. So Maathai, obviously, I think you've picked up here, allowed herself to see the suffering both of women and of the land and judged that something could be done to remedy the problem. Her judgment led her to choose again and again, act. Act decisively, act courageously, do something. Put yourself at the disposal. Both of my impoverished sisters and the deforested land would be something that she would do again and again. She acted for the benefit of the current and future generations, at times risking her life and personal freedom. And Maathai and her Greenbelt sisters model well the transformative power of thinking and acting with one another and with God's creatures. Wangari Maathai is surely owed our gratitude for a Christian, theologically informed, praxis-oriented environmentalism, buoyed by hope and committed to peace. So, folks, having finished this presentation last week and feeling, okay, Not too bad. I wakened early this morning, like at 4:40, and I could hear Wangari Maathai telling me in her beautiful African accented voice, say just a little bit more. So I have to honor her. So I'm just going to show you 3 slides and ask you to look at them in silence. Okay? These are her books in case you want to read them. And if I had been smarter and wiser, I probably could have tried to get some ordered, but I never thought there'd be so many people coming to be honest, anyway. So there they are, Greenbelt Movement, her strategies, Unbowed. Some of it becomes a bit repetitious if you read them all within a few weeks. Challenge for Africa, Replenishing the Earth. Okay, I'll leave you with one final quote. And the normal thing here is if you want to raise a question, you certainly are welcome to do so. There's a microphone in the back. It will help your voice to carry. If you wanted just to say that you learned something and let somebody else hear it out loud, I sometimes find that better. I know it's not the usual model here, but sometimes it just sort of like affirms something in somebody else. If I was in the classroom and have some little buzz session or something. But if you have any questions, if you need to leave, certainly do that. I'll be here for 15 minutes or so for questions. If you would like to have a little refreshment, there's some over there for you to have. So I'll give you a little time for people who need to clear out.
Must have been a lot of extra credit.
That's all right.
So I've moved the microphone up. If anybody has any comments to share with Dr. Clifford or any questions to ask, please come on up to the microphone, and then afterward we'll enjoy what's left of the refreshments.
I was wondering, had she not had that Catholic background, do you feel that she still would have promoted the same ideals or had all of that?
Well, I think she likely would have. She said that when she first started out, she wasn't really seeing these things in some kind of deeply spiritual sense. It was with time that she began to reflect, and that's especially true in her last book, Replenishing the Earth, that she began to realize that there was more than just the thing. I think she was so caught up in doing everything that she wasn't all that tuned in to that aspect. And then gradually it became clear to her, oh, this is coming from something in me that started when I was a child, 12 at least, if not earlier. But I think, it doesn't take Catholic to be that. It's just, this is the Catholic supple chair lecture. I think I would have still spoken about her if she had been a good Lutheran woman, to be honest, okay? Or Methodist or whatever. I probably could have found some kind of way to bring it in. It's been a little bit thinner on Pope citations, anyway. Yes, what can I do for you?
You say that, but what she says seems to be much more in line with like Catholic teachings. I don't know if you follow the Republican presidential race.
Yes, it's hard not to follow it because it just comes at you every second. I wish sometimes we could sort of like focus on the bigger world. But go ahead, you have a question or comment?
Rick Santorum said at his speech one time, somehow the Keystone Pipeline came up. He said that the president was being led by people who believed in like a phony theology, and he was talking about environmentalists. And I was just wondering, how did that happen? How did this Catholic teaching turn into let's drill, baby, drill? How did that happen?
I really don't know how Rick Santorum has processed Catholic teachings, especially the latest encyclical of Pope Benedict XVI. It's a big long letter on charity and truth, because it's pretty clear that taking care of the environment is a Catholic value. Now, I have to say, the Catholic Church sort of ignored it for a long time, but hasn't really ignored it all that much since the 1990s, at least. Certainly in the United States, the Catholic bishops were writing about it early, mid-70s, 1970s. But yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I know that he's a fellow Pennsylvanian, but I just cannot get totally into his head.
Are you a Republican? Are you a Republican?
I'm not going to have confession about my... I can't help being Catholic supple chair. You kind of figure she's probably a Catholic. Although that's not really essential for the position, but no, I'm not confessing. I've told students I've been a Republican, I've been a Democrat. Some days I think I'm an independent. I've been it all. So you live long enough, you try a lot of different hats on. Anybody else? So, okay. So thank you for staying to the end. That's really nice. I would have felt lonesome up here all by my lonesome self here. I guess I would have had enough sense to get off the stage.